There is still this prejudice that humans have a language which is far and away above any other species qualitatively. But looking at the complexity of the relationship of dolphin signals to each other, we've discovered that they definitely have a very high communication intelligence. I think Lily's big insight was how intelligent dolphins really are. Mind-altering substances. For some reason, us humans absolutely love them. Whether it be alcohol or drugs, humans have always partaken in these to help medically or to just have fun. Some of these are natural and have been used since the dinosaurs, and some are super, super unnatural. Even though the entirety of this video is not about drugs, I 100% believe that this experiment never would have come to fruition had it not been for lysergic acid diethylamide, otherwise known as LSD. This video is going to take a dive into an experiment that occurred in the 1960s. It involved some LSD, a man named Dr. Lilly, a woman named Margaret Levitt, and a dolphin named Peter. There are a lot of players in this story and so many different angles that it has taken me weeks to pull everything together and to make sense of it all. But I'm going to break this video down into 5 different parts to try to make it a little easier to get through the information. The first part is going to be the discovery of LSD. Second is going to be who is Dr. Lilly. Third, who is Margaret Levitt Howe. Fourth, the experiment itself. And then finally, number 5 is going to be the aftermath of the experiment. So let's take a short look into the drug that fueled a lot of the experiment that we're going to talk about, LSD. LSD was first made by a Swiss scientist, Albert Hofmann, in 1938. It was a completely innocent concoction that Hofmann used in experiments until one fateful day in 1943. Albert accidentally ingested some of this chemical and experienced extraordinary shapes with an intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. 3 days later, Hofmann decided to try a larger dose, got on his bike, and rode around his town tripping balls on the very first intentional acid trip. LSD became sought after by many different governmental organizations after this for tests and mind control experiments that definitely had nothing to do with any unethical human research. Definitely not. Let's start with a quote about John from actor Jeff Bridges, who had met and become friendly with Lilly at a Hollywood party. He said, "John Lilly was above all an explorer of the brain and mind, and all of those drugs that expand our consciousness. There weren't too many people with his expertise and his scientific background doing that kind of work." Dr. Lilly was an absolutely unbelievably brilliant man, who I think was the overachiever of his time. Let me list his titles for you, just so I can really drive home how much of an overachiever this guy was. He was a physician, neuroscientist, psychoanalyst, psychonaut, philosopher, writer, and inventor. I gotta say, knowing that I've always been the perfectionist type and an overachiever in my life, this guy makes me feel like I have the ambition of a turnip. John was born on January 6, 1915, but since there was so much to talk about in his adult life, we are not going to spend any time in his childhood. So we're going to fast forward to 1949. Lilly had just completed many years of schooling in many different majors in many different schools. So just so I don't need to list all of that off, let's have a rolling screen of text tell you all of it for me. In 1949, Lilly came across a beach pilot whale and was amazed by the size of the creature and the size of his brain. Him coming across this animal at this time had to be fate. At this period of history, there was a huge scientific belief that the size of the brain was a direct correlation to the intelligence of that creature. So when Lilly saw the size of the brain of this pilot whale, he was immediately intrigued and began to hypothesize and dream. This event brought about a new obsession for Lilly, one that would consume years of his life. Throughout the 1950s, Lilly would charter sailboats with his wife and would spend hours and days just sailing around, hoping to find another large beached sea animal to study and observe. In the late 1950s, Lilly visited marine studios, which housed dolphins who were actors in the television series Flipper. This visit inspired Lilly to stop sailing around looking for dead sea animals and just start studying the brains of the living sea animals around him. So, with some funding from the United States Navy and NASA, Lilly built the Dolphinarium, a large laboratory in St. Thomas, and had the original goal of exploring human-animal communication with a side of possibly contacting aliens. You know, sciencey things. 3 dolphins, Sissy, Pamela, and Peter were moved in, and then the experiments began. Now on to our leading lady, Margaret. Margaret Levitt grew up in St. Thomas on the Virgin Islands. From childhood, Margaret had a fascination with animals and the possibility of finding a way to communicate with them. This love for animals came from her favorite childhood book, Miss Kelly, a book that was about a cat that had the ability to speak to humans. In 1963, Margaret's brother-in-law told her about a new laboratory with dolphins that was opening up on the island, and she was instantly intrigued. So early the next year, she showed up at the Dolphinarium saying that she was curious. And the men who worked inside were intrigued. When asked by Bateson, who was Lily's lab director, why she was there, she replied, "Well, I heard you have dolphins, and I thought I'd come to see if there was anything I could do." Bateson was apparently surprised by her bravado, as he said, and took her to meet the animals. After seeing her natural ability with the dolphins, he invited her to watch them for a while and to record any observations that she made. At the end of the day, Bateson was impressed by her intuitive observation techniques and animal handling, and invited her to return to the lab whenever she wanted. Alright, so we will talk a little bit more about Margaret's story in the later parts of the experiment and much more in the aftermath of the experiment, but for now, let's start trying to understand this controversial experiment that changed the way science looked at human-animal communication for the rest of time. Okay, the lead up to this experiment is confusing. How they got from point A to point B, to me at least, seems pretty convoluted. But experiments in that time all kind of come across like this, so we'll try to piece this together. In the early 1960s, Lilly started to explore the human consciousness. He wanted to know what made our minds work, which was definitely a noble endeavor. After Lilly was introduced to LSD at a party, he started mixing this into his experiments, though. He would lay in an isolation tank that he had created a few years prior, tripping on LSD, sometime in the company of dolphins. Like, what a fucking time to be alive, really. Lilly and his associates published a paper, and later a book by Lilly called Man and Dolphin, that explored the possibility that they could teach dolphins to use human speech after noting that they had been able to teach dolphins to mimic speech sounds, the ones that babies are usually first able to make, like wah, wah, bah. Sounds like that. This book brought Lilly and his theories to the minds of some notable scientists that were trying to find ways to speak with extraterrestrials at the time, to look into new ideas of what intelligence in other species may look like, and how man could leverage this to their uses. You know, as humans do, we like to leverage things. And believe that Lilly's work would open new doors for them. The interest that his book brought to this experiment is what landed him the funding to take it even further. Lilly won backing from NASA, confirmed, the US Navy, confirmed, and allegedly other US intelligence agencies that shall remain nameless, with the aim of nurturing closer relationships between man and dolphins. Alright, we're gonna have a side note here, because I smell bullshit. Why would NASA get involved with an experiment trying to prove that you can teach dolphins to understand and use human vernacular during what is arguably their busiest decade to date? This decade is also the time when NASA themselves said that they would not be focusing on many outside projects because, you know, the space race was a thing at the time. Could this give merit to all those fake moon landing conspiracy theories? Because if they had time to worry about getting a man high on LSD to teach dolphins to talk, then surely getting a man to the moon couldn't have been too difficult, right? Like, now I understand that they received a ton of funding throughout this area, but wouldn't you want to put the money towards making sure that those men that you are sending to the moon return as men and not, stardust? Instead of trying to speak to sea creatures? I don't know. Just me. Moving on. The Dolphinarium opened in 1964, and having met Margaret through Bateson, Lily offered her employment. She would become responsible for programming for the dolphins when Lily was traveling, which eventually just meant that she was responsible for the programming for the dolphins at all time. Margaret felt that there was a particular hindrance to this experiment, though, and quickly worked to come up with an idea that Lily, still high on LSD, would like. Finally, it hit her. Why was she leaving every evening? If she were to live with Peter around the clock, it would allow for more opportunities to teach. Lily, of course, loved this idea and told her to get the lab ready and to start the experiment. Hal began with waterproofing the upper levels of the lab and filling it all with water. This would allow Peter more access to the upper levels of the lab and would increase the possibility of teachable moments. Margaret would be able to try to nurture and teach the dolphin in a way a mother would teach a baby. By the summer of 1965, the lab was ready to begin the experiment. So, a little rundown of how the experiment was supposed to work before we actually delve into what happened. So, for the experiment, Hal was to live in isolation with Peter 6 days a week. Hal would sleep on a makeshift bed that was set up on the elevator platform in the middle of the room. She had a desk that was suspended above the water, which would allow her to do paperwork while still being close and able to observe Peter. On day 7, Peter would return to the main pool with the 2 other dolphins for socialization. Hal recalled laying in her bed on the first night of the experiment, absolutely questioning everything that she was doing. But this passed fairly quickly, and she jumped into the work the next day and never looked back. Margaret kept absolutely meticulous notes and audio recordings of all lessons, but she quickly realized that downtime was when Peter learned the most. The young dolphin quickly learned how to verbalize, "Hello, Margaret." At first he had problems with the M sound, but learned that rolling over in the water and using bubbles to make the sound worked for him. As the experiment went on, Margaret noted Peter's fascination in her anatomy, saying he was very, very interested in my anatomy. If I was sitting here and my legs were in the water, he would come up and look at the back of my knees for a long time. He wanted to know how that thing worked, and I was so charmed by it. There was one issue with the experiment that Margaret noticed quickly. Peter was a young dolphin who was starting to grow sexual urges. When she would notice that Peter was exhibiting these behaviors, she would move him to the larger tank with the other dolphins. At some point, she began to feel that this was disrupting the experiment, so she began relieving Peter's urges herself so that the lessons would not be disturbed. Years later, she told The Guardian, "I allowed that. I wasn't uncomfortable with it, as long as it wasn't rough. It would just become part of what was going on, like an itch, just to get rid of it and move on." And that's how it seemed to work out. It wasn't private. People could observe it. As you can tell from her statement on the matter, there was absolutely nothing sexual about this to Margaret. She also said, "I was there to get to know Peter, and that was part of Peter." It is unclear when, but somewhere around this time, Lily started using LSD to experiment on the dolphins. He tried many, many times to get some sort of effect on the dolphins, but was never able to accomplish this. Margaret at this point stated that she hated this, but felt powerless to get him to stop. But she was able to get him to agree to not test the LSD on Peter. By fall of 1966, Lily was losing interest in the dolphin experiments in favor of experimenting with LSD. Shocker. He stopped caring for the dolphins, lost funding for the lab. His partner Gregory Bateson peaced out soon after this due to Lily's behavior and quote-unquote differences. So shortly after Margaret's experiment ended, the lab was shut down. Margaret worked to help decommission the lab and get the dolphins ready to go to their new homes, but she was devastated. She had grown so close to Peter, and Peter had developed such a bond with her that it broke both of their hearts. She tried so hard to find a different option for housing for Peter, but with no luck, she had no choice but to allow John to send Peter to his other lab in Miami, Florida. For the aftermath of this experiment, we're going to do it in a little bit out of order. It will make sense in the end as to why I do this, I promise. So we're going to start with Hustler. I know that seems like a really weird addition to the story, but believe me, it's a part of this for some reason. Back in the 1970s, Hustler was known for their weird shit. I honestly don't know how else to word that, but they were into weird shit. Like bestiality type weird shit. So when someone at Hustler heard of Margaret's experiment and the fact that she had taken it upon herself to relieve Peter's sexual urges, they naturally wrote an article chronicling what they deemed a love story between a woman and a dolphin. Ugh. That's really all I'm going to say about the Hustler article. Except, don't have sex with dolphins. Like, seriously, what else can I say? This is ridiculous. Alright, so there's going to be a trigger warning for this next part of the video. It's incredibly sad, involves animal suicide, so if this is something that may bother you, I'll put a timestamp here, and you can skip to that part, and we'll be all done the sad stuff. So dolphins are incredibly intelligent, complex creatures. We know that they feel emotions. Another thing we know about dolphins is that they are not automatic breathers. Peter became very depressed after moving to Miami. He was living in a small pool that was not well lit and had no natural lighting. John noted that Peter was deteriorating from the moment they left St. Thomas, and within a few weeks after settling into the new lab, Lily called Margaret to inform her that Peter had passed away. When asked what happened to the young dolphin, Lily simply stated that he committed suicide and ended the conversation. Animal suicide is a controversial phenomenon that is highly contested, but animal behaviorists believe that in Peter's case, he became depressed after being separated from Margaret, and without being able to rationalize what happened, he simply decided to stop living. This absolutely devastated Margaret, but she was also strangely comforted with knowing that no harm could come to Peter now, and that he would no longer be suffering. Dr. Lilly continued to experiment with dolphins and other animals, trying to prove that he could find a way to communicate with them. His methods started becoming more and more bizarre due to the amount of LSD he was ingesting, though. Margaret married the photographer from the experiment, and they went on to have 3 children together. Strangely enough, they renovated the Dolphinarium into a family home, and this is where they raised their children. Margaret has received letters from people over the years who are also studying dolphins, crediting her story for their inspiration to go into the field. Which, from Margaret's words, seems to warm her heart every time. And that's the end of this strange experiment. that was riddled with drugs, misinformation, hopes, dreams, and ultimately devastation. Margaret Levitt Howe is an amazingly brilliant woman that, in my opinion, deserves more of the accolades for this experiment than she receives. Without her initial idea, her determination, her perseverance, and strong will, this experiment would not have happened. And just my final note, shame on Hustler. While researching this video, I found so many news reports from radio stations and small news networks that only concentrated on what Hustler wrote. Like, come on, guys. Hustler took this story and turned it into something that it was not. Margaret has even said that in the beginning, this article took a huge toll on her mentally. Like, could you imagine the feeling of having this experiment that you put your life into and just have it turn into a story of bestiality that is now more famous than the experiment itself? Gross, Hustler. Gross. Anyways, thank you for joining me for another look into something in history that I want to talk about. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button and, make me happy by subscribing. I don't know. I love you all. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye-bye.